You walk into a small windowless room, pale walls, buzzing fluorescent light. It smells like dust and something sterile, something clinical. There's a clipboard, a row of switches labeled in volts 15, 30, 45, all the way to 450. The labels grow darker as the numbers rise. Slight shock, moderate shock, severe shock, and finally, XXX. You're told this is a learning experiment. The man beside you wears a white coat. He seems calm, intelligent, collected. He tells you that your job is to help the learner, a man strapped into a chair in the next room. Remember word pairs. Every time he gets one wrong, you press a button. A small jolt. You hesitate, but the man in the coat assures you that it's safe. It's for science, and you want to help. You want to do the right thing. The learner makes a few mistakes. You press the button. He yelps, then cries, then begs. You look back at the man in the lab coat, eyes wide, unsure. "Please continue," he says without raising his voice. His tone is neutral, professional. It's not a demand, it's a suggestion. You're not forced, you're just encouraged. And something strange happens. You continue, even as the man screams, even as he pounds the walls, even when he goes silent. You keep pressing the buttons all the way to the end. This was not a nightmare. It was a real experiment conducted by Stanley Milgram in 1961. His question was simple, chilling, and strangely timeless. Would ordinary people obey authority even when doing so causes harm to another human being? The result, 65% of participants delivered what they believed to be lethal shocks simply because they were told to. No threats, no punishment. Just the presence of authority and a voice that calmly told them to go on. It wasn't rage that led them there. It wasn't even belief in what they were doing. It was something more quiet, more familiar. A need to comply, to follow rules, to not be the one who disrupts the experiment. And here's the deeper discomfort: these people weren't monsters. They were secretaries, mailmen, students, salesmen. They were polite, normal, just like us. We like to believe that morality is instinctive, that we'll know when something is wrong and stand up to it. But what if the truth is softer, blurrier? What if morality bends under the weight of social cues, uniforms, gentle pressure? What if in the right conditions you too would press that button? Milgram didn't invent obedience, he just revealed how fragile our boundaries are when confronted by structure. It turns out the human mind is deeply trained to defer to authority. From childhood, we're rewarded for being good, which often means being compliant. Sit down, don't talk back, do what you're told. And those lessons become scripts we recite even when our conscience twitches, even when the silence on the other side of the wall feels unbearable, even when something inside whispers, "This isn't right." And so we begin to see how obedience isn't always born of belief. It can be born of fear, of wanting to be seen as cooperative, of avoiding confrontation, of trusting the system over our own perception. This is the paradox. The same quality that makes society function, our ability to follow instructions, is also the quality that can lead us to commit quiet cruelties in the name of protocol. When morality becomes externalized, when we let someone else hold the compass, we risk becoming lost in a sea of instructions. The voice that says, "Please continue," becomes louder than the voice inside that says, "Please stop." So, how does this live inside you? Now maybe it's in the meeting where you nod along with something that feels off. Maybe it's in the relationship where you suppress your instincts to keep the peace. Maybe it's in the way you silence yourself when a group agrees on something you quietly resist. The lab coat doesn't always look like a lab coat. Sometimes it looks like a boss, sometimes a parent, sometimes a culture, sometimes just a social expectation that hovers over the room like static. And in those moments, the question isn't just, what's right? It's, what do I fear losing if I speak up? And perhaps that's the heart of Milgram's revelation, that the real danger isn't the man in the coat. It's the part of you that surrenders too quickly to him. The part that hands over your agency, your voice, your ethics. Not because you're weak, but because you've been taught that obedience is safer than rebellion. That silence is smoother than resistance. That going along is easier than questioning. And sometimes it is. But it also costs something. You walk out of that room years later and you still hear the sound of the button clicking. You remember your own breath, the sweat on your palms, the stillness of the man in the coat. And you wonder, did I fail a test? Or did I finally see what I'm made of? So maybe tonight, in this quiet moment, you can look back into that room not with shame but with awareness. You can ask, when have I obeyed when I should have paused? When have I confused politeness with goodness? And when the next voice asks you to please continue, you might just take a breath and ask your own question, why? There is a basement in the heart of Stanford University. No windows, no clocks, just narrow hallways, steel-barred doors, and the stale air of control. You sign up for what you think is a psychology experiment, a study on prison life. You're told it'll last 2 weeks, a simulation, nothing real, just roles to play prisoner or guard. You laugh with the other volunteers, shake hands, exchange names, but by the next morning your name is gone. You're just a number now. You wear a smock. You sleep in a cell. You eat when told, speak only when permitted. And the guards, they're your peers. But something in them shifts when the sunglasses go on. They patrol the corridor with batons and smirks, taunting you, shouting, stripping away your sense of self, one rule at a time. You tell yourself it's just a game, but the fear feels real, and the humiliation sinks deeper than expected. You stop resisting, you stop thinking, you just try to get through the day. The Stanford prison experiment, led by Philip Zimbardo in 1971, was supposed to explore how people adapt to roles. But it became something far darker. Within 36 hours, breakdowns began. Guards grew sadistic. Prisoners became passive, numb, withdrawn. What was meant to last 2 weeks was terminated after 6 days, not because the data was complete, but because the damage was real. And it raised a question we still haven't answered: how quickly can a costume consume a person? The transformation wasn't forced, it emerged. It emerged from the mask of power, from the illusion of separation between us and them. What's terrifying isn't just how the guards acted, it's how easily they forgot they were acting. How the uniform became identity, how cruelty became routine, and how quickly human empathy can evaporate under the heat of a sanctioned role. Jung would call this a shadow possession, a moment when the unconscious overtakes the conscious self and the mask fuses to the face. Zimbardo himself would later admit he too got lost. As the superintendent of the simulated prison, he didn't intervene. He watched, took notes, let the experiment unfold, believing he was neutral. But neutrality in the presence of harm is never neutral, it's participation. The deeper truth exposed by this experiment wasn't about the few who played the guards. It was about all of us, the parts of ourselves that crave structure, hierarchy, clarity. The part that whispers, "I'm just doing my job." The part that slowly stops questioning the script once we've rehearsed it enough times. And what about the prisoners? They began as students, joking, skeptical, fully aware it was all pretend. But when stripped of name, privacy, agency, the pretending stopped. What replaced it wasn't submission, it was learned helplessness. The feeling that nothing you do matters, that resistance is pointless, that the only choice left is internal retreat. The bars weren't metal, they were psychological, and yet they held. This is the paradox: we are capable of transformation so fast, so total, that even we don't notice it happening. One moment we are kind, empathetic, curious. The next, we are enforcers of arbitrary rules or silent participants in someone else's pain. And we tell ourselves it's not who we really are. But what if it is? Or more precisely, what if who we are is malleable? A shifting field of possibility that takes shape depending on the room we're in, the role we're handed, the power we're given or denied. Think about your own life. Not in a prison, but in smaller cages. The workplace where you speak differently because of hierarchy. The friend group where you become someone else just to maintain peace. The relationship where the dynamic subtly shifts and you begin to accept what once felt unthinkable. Roles don't just reflect us, they shape us. And when those roles go unquestioned, they calcify. They sink beneath the skin. You stop playing the part and start becoming it. Adler believed that all behavior is goal-oriented, even cruelty. The guards weren't evil. They were fulfilling a new role, trying to perform power in the only way they understood, through dominance, control, humiliation. When people feel powerless in one part of their life, they may grasp control wherever it's offered, even if that control means someone else suffers, especially if the rules allow it, especially if the suffering is framed as deserved. So we ask, where does accountability begin? Is it in the design of the system, the people in power, or the silent collaborators who look away? And where do you see these dynamics playing out now, not in labs, but in offices, institutions, families, nations? The prison is not always made of bars. Sometimes it's made of scripts, beliefs, labels, a title, a dress code, a badge. And sometimes the prison is internal. The story you've told yourself about what you must be in order to survive. Guard, prisoner, observer. We slip between these roles more often than we realize. So, what breaks the cycle? Not rebellion, born of rage, but awareness born of stillness. To pause even for a breath and ask, who am I becoming in this role? What am I enforcing without meaning to? And if I took off the mask, what would remain? Because maybe the scariest part of the Stanford prison experiment isn't that it happened. It's that it worked. It revealed how fragile the boundary is between kindness and cruelty, and how quickly power, when unchecked, can turn people into something unrecognizable, even to themselves. You walk out of the basement and the air feels different. But something lingers, a question soft but persistent. What roles am I playing? And which ones are playing me? You walk into a quiet room, 5 chairs, 5 people already seated. They greet you politely with practiced stillness, their eyes tracing your every move. A researcher enters and shows a simple task, 3 lines on a card, A, B, and C, and another single line to compare. Which one is the same length? It's obvious. Everyone can see it. You say to yourself, this'll be easy. The researcher asks each person to answer aloud one by one. The first says C. You frown. That's wrong. The second also says C. So does the third. And the fourth? All wrong. Now it's your turn. You hesitate. You look at the lines again. You haven't gone blind. The answer is clearly A. But you feel heat rising in your neck, a slight tremor in your hands. You open your mouth and say C, just like the others. This is the Ash conformity experiment, a quiet, brilliant trap for the human psyche. In the 1950s, Solomon Asch wanted to see if people would conform to a clearly incorrect group judgment. The answer was yes. Over 75% of participants conformed at least once, choosing what was obviously false just to match the group. Not because they believed it, but because standing alone, even silently, felt harder than betraying what they saw with their own eyes. That's the paradox. The truth is simple but not easy. Not when belonging is on the line. So here you are in the waiting room of conformity, a place we all visit more often than we realize. You nod when you want to disagree. You smile when you want to leave. You say yes because no would feel like exile. The group becomes your compass, even if it leads you in circles. And slowly, you start questioning your own eyes, your own instincts, your own voice. Jung believed that the crowd has a soul of its own, a collective psyche that overtakes individual awareness. When we conform, we are not merely obeying, we are dissolving, merging into something that feels safer, less exposed. It is the child who learns to blend in to avoid punishment, the teenager who laughs along to avoid rejection, the adult who chooses silence in a room full of nodding heads. And the mechanism isn't always fear. Sometimes it's longing, a desire to feel included, seen. Belonging, after all, is survival. The problem is not the desire to belong, it's the cost. When you deny what you see, what you know, what you feel, in exchange for the approval of others, a small part of you goes numb. And the more often you do it, the more distant you become from your own center. That is the hidden wound of conformity, not that it changes your opinion, but that it quietly erodes your relationship with truth. Imagine the symbolic image, a room full of mirrors, each angled slightly to reflect the others. You can't see yourself directly. Only fragments, distortions, faces looking back at you that don't quite belong to you. This is the world of groupthink and echo chamber where certainty feels communal, even if it's false. You begin to prefer the safety of agreement over the discomfort of clarity. Now think about your own life. The meetings where you stayed silent not because you agreed, but because you didn't want to be difficult. The friendships where you nodded along with values that didn't feel quite yours. The moments where you edited your laughter, your opinions, your body language just to fit. These moments seem small, but they accumulate. And over time, you begin to forget where the performance ends and the real self begins. Alfred Adler believed that people are driven not by past wounds, but by future goals, by the purpose they attach to life. And often that purpose is to avoid rejection. If you learned early on that standing out meant being hurt, ignored, or misunderstood, then blending in becomes a shield, a survival strategy. And once the strategy works, it becomes a habit, and then a personality, and then an identity. You're no longer someone who conforms. You're a people pleaser, a team player, easygoing. The labels seem kind, but underneath them, your real voice is buried. So ask yourself, what truth have I edited to be accepted? What opinion have I softened just enough to fit the room? What instinct have I swallowed before it ever reached my lips? The conformity trap doesn't always shout. Often it whispers, "Don't make it awkward. Don't ruin the mood. It's not a big deal." But it is, because every small silence becomes a stone, and one day you realize you've built a wall around your own authenticity. The Ash experiment didn't end in that lab. It continues in every boardroom, classroom, group chat, and dinner table where someone sees the truth and chooses not to say it. And every time someone does speak up softly, bravely, it shifts something. Maybe not the outcome, but the atmosphere. It creates space. It reminds the others that they are not alone in what they see, and that maybe they're not crazy. So next time you're in that room, whatever shape it takes, pause, look again. Not at the lines, but at the faces, the tension in the air, the silence between answers, and then look inward toward the compass you were born with, the one that doesn't need approval to point north. And when your turn comes, ask yourself gently, am I seeing what I see, or what they want me to see? You're running late. Your heart beats faster as your shoes tap across the pavement. There's a meeting, a lecture, a deadline you can't miss. You rehearse what you'll say once you arrive, apologizing, explaining, justifying the lost minutes. And then there it is. A person slumped on the sidewalk, clearly struggling. Maybe they've fallen. Maybe they're in pain. Maybe they just need someone to stop. You hesitate. Your eyes dart toward the street, toward the clock tower in the distance. You feel torn. This is wrong, you think. I should help. But still, your legs keep moving. Because in that moment, the urgency of your schedule feels heavier than the suffering of a stranger. And when you reach your destination, you tell yourself it was nothing, that someone else probably helped, that you weren't equipped, that you didn't have time. This moment, mundane, fleeting, was the subject of a real experiment in 1973 conducted at Princeton Theological Seminary. The researchers invited students to give a speech on the parable of the Good Samaritan. Some were told they were running late, others that they had ample time. On the way to deliver their talk, each student passed a man slumped in a doorway, clearly in distress. Those who thought they were late. Nearly 90% didn't stop. Those who had time, the majority did. What the researchers found wasn't cruelty or callousness. It was something quieter, more unsettling. People failed to help, not because they didn't care, but because they were in a rush. This is the paradox. The faster our lives move, the more invisible pain becomes. The more efficient we try to be, the more likely we are to miss the humanity around us. It's not that empathy disappears, it just gets drowned out by urgency. The task replaces the moment, the schedule replaces the soul. Time in this context becomes a psychological defense. When we feel too busy to stop, we give ourselves permission to detach, to compartmentalize, to pretend we didn't see, because stopping would mean admitting that we live in a world where people suffer in plain view. And that, maybe, we're a part of that. Gabor Mate speaks often about how modern life rewards disconnection, that we've designed systems that separate us from our instincts, our bodies, even our sense of community. The bystander isn't born cruel, they're born distracted, conditioned to prioritize output over presence. And it's not just a cultural problem, it's neurological. When we're stressed, the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for empathy and moral reasoning, literally shuts down. We go into tunnel vision. We survive the moment, and in that state, compassion becomes a luxury we believe we can't afford. But think about it, how many small acts of care never happen, not because we don't want to do them, but because we've convinced ourselves we don't have the time. You see someone crying on the subway and look away. A coworker pauses before speaking clearly, holding something back, and you don't ask. A friend sends a vague message and you mean to check in but forget. The pain wasn't invisible. It was just inconvenient. Jung might say this is the shadow of modern productivity, the part of ourselves that prioritizes performance over presence. We glorify movement, achievement, busyness. But in doing so, we lose our capacity to pause, to feel, to act from stillness. And the strange thing is, we often become proud of it. I'm swamped, we say. No time for anything. It becomes a badge, a shield. And beneath it, someone stumbles, and no one stops. Imagine a symbolic image here, a long hallway lined with clocks, each ticking in a slightly different rhythm. People rush past heads down, clutching their schedules like sacred texts. And in the center, someone kneels unseen as time flows around them like a river. This is the modern dilemma. We are good people in too much of a hurry to act like it. Adler believed that human behavior is always purposeful. Even inaction has a function. It preserves our image, reduces our discomfort, protects our fragile illusion of control. And so when faced with suffering, we calculate, we rationalize. We edit the story in real time. He's probably fine. It's not my place. I'd help if I could. And just like that, the moment passes. The person remains. And something inside us grows quieter. The Good Samaritan story. The original parable was never just about helping, it was about interruption, the willingness to break one's journey for another, and in that interruption to find something sacred. But in today's world, interruption feels like failure. It's inefficient, messy, emotionally expensive. So we walk past the sacred and call it noise. So ask yourself, when was the last time you allowed yourself to be late for something because someone else needed you more? When was the last time you let presence outrank performance? And if that feels hard, you're not alone. We are not trained to live slowly, but maybe that's the beginning. Not grand heroics, just a soft awareness that begins to interrupt the flow. A glance that lingers, a step that pauses, a question asked. And maybe one day you walk down that same corridor, see someone in need, and stop not because you have time, but because you remembered that you are time. That your presence, your choice, your breath is the miracle. Because when someone needs help, what they often need most is for someone to notice that the world didn't keep rushing by. The dog lies still. The floor beneath it pulses with soft electric shocks, not constant, not unbearable, but frequent enough to provoke a wince. You expect it to move, to leap over the low divider just inches away where safety waits. But it doesn't. It stays curled in the same corner, trembling eyes dull. You watch confused. This dog has escaped before. It knows it can. But something's changed. Somewhere along the line it stopped trying, not because it forgot the way out, but because it stopped believing escape was possible. This was the discovery of Martin Seligman in the 1960s, an experiment that birthed the term learned helplessness. A theory that would echo far beyond the lab, whispering its implications into classrooms, workplaces, relationships, entire generations. Seligman exposed animals to unavoidable shocks. No button, no escape, no relief. Eventually, when placed in situations where freedom was possible, many simply stayed. They had learned at a core level that nothing they did would change their reality. So they gave up, not out of weakness, but from experience, from exhaustion, from a nervous system that had memorized despair. And what about us? What shocks have we endured that no longer arrive through wires but through words, through silence, through repeated disappointments that wear grooves into the mind until hope feels like a risk too great to take? Maybe it started in childhood when every attempt to be heard was met with dismissal. Maybe it continued in systems that punished effort with indifference. Maybe it lives now in the stories we tell ourselves. It won't make a difference. No one will listen. Why bother? Learned helplessness doesn't look dramatic. It looks quiet. It looks like the student who stops raising their hand, the employee who stops offering ideas, the partner who stops asking to be seen. It looks like fatigue but deeper. A bone-deep resignation that says, this is just how things are. And the tragedy is, by the time an exit appears, the belief that one can walk through it has already withered. Gabor Mate would remind us that this passivity isn't laziness, it's a survival adaptation. When escape is impossible, the body shuts down parts of itself to preserve energy. The organism learns to endure, to numb, to shrink itself around the pain. It's not a failure of will. It's the nervous system doing what it must. The problem is that our environment changes, but the imprint remains. The cage is gone, but we still act as though it's there. Jung might say that the inner child, wounded and unprotected, internalizes the helplessness. It becomes a core belief: I am powerless. I am small. And that belief, once lodged in the psyche, begins to shape the adult. You no longer need someone else to limit you, you do it to yourself. Not consciously, not cruelly, but quietly, automatically. You don't even feel the collar anymore. Imagine the symbolic image here: a key resting in the middle of an open room untouched, while the one who needs it sits in a corner facing the wall. They do not turn. They do not ask. Not because they are blind, but because their past has taught them that the key doesn't belong to them, that even when the lock breaks, they must remain still. This is the paradox. We often confuse endurance with wisdom. We say, they're so strong, they never complain. But maybe silence isn't always strength. Maybe it's surrender. Maybe the strongest thing someone can do is try again after years of believing it's pointless. To knock on a door they've been told will never open. To speak a truth they've long been punished for. To move towards something even when the memory of shock still echoes in the body. And yet, how many of us stay in places that wound us not because we like the pain, but because the alternative feels like a lie we can't afford to believe in? What if I leave and it's worse? What if I ask and get rejected? What if I hope and lose again? These are not foolish questions. They're protective ones. The nervous system remembers, and it prefers a known prison to an unknown freedom. Adler's perspective might shift the lens slightly. He believed we are not merely shaped by the past, we move toward imagined futures. If your imagined future is bleak, then of course you won't act. You won't leap the divider. The key lies untouched, not because you don't want change, but because you've forgotten how to believe in it. So, where does healing begin? Maybe not with a grand act of rebellion, but with a soft question. What if it's different now? What if you pressed against the edge of the cage not to escape, but just to see if it's still there? What if trying this time isn't about success or failure, but about reclaiming the part of you that stopped trying at all? We carry the echoes of those early shocks, the dismissals, the betrayals, the moments we weren't chosen, weren't believed, weren't held. But those echoes aren't the truth. They're reminders of how adaptable we are. And that same adaptability can be turned toward hope, toward movement, toward one small step in a direction that feels new. So you imagine it again: the dog in the chamber, the low fence, the space beyond. And this time maybe it stands, just once, just long enough to look, just long enough to wonder. Could there be something else? And maybe, so could you. There's a doll in the room, round-bodied, wide-eyed, smiling despite its fate. You recognize it instantly, the kind that bounces back up when you knock it down. A toy built to take the hit, to endure, to never fight back. The room is bare save for a child watching a screen. On it, a woman yells at the doll, strikes it with a mallet, kicks it, throws it. Her face shows no remorse, only amusement. The child watches in silence. Then, left alone with the doll, the child imitates every movement. Not just the actions, but the tone, the anger, the rhythm, blow for blow. This was the Bobo doll experiment, Albert Bandura's study in the early 1960s, that showed something hauntingly simple. Children don't just learn by instruction, they learn by watching, by absorbing. by mimicking what's modeled even when no one says a word. And what they absorb isn't just behavior. It's emotion. It's permission. It's a blueprint for how power looks and how pain is delivered. The Bobo doll doesn't bleed, doesn't cry, doesn't leave. So the violence feels harmless, but in the psyche of a child it becomes something else entirely, an unconscious script. Not learned through explanation, but through exposure. This is the paradox: we remember the things we were never taught. We carry the gestures we were never meant to copy. And often we don't realize we've inherited violence until it appears in our own hands, our own tone, our own need to control. It's easy to dismiss a child's outburst. Harder to recognize the mirror they hold up. Harder still to admit that some of our darkest instincts may not be ours, they were passed down. Gabor Mate writes about the legacy of trauma as something transmitted not only through abuse, but through absence, through what is modeled in silence, through tension never named but always present. The child watches the slammed door, the flinched shoulder, the withheld affection, and learns that connection requires submission, that anger is how love is expressed, that tenderness must be earned. No one says these things, but the body memorizes them anyway. And so we grow up carrying the doll inside us, not the object, but the symbol, the part of us that expects to be knocked down, that accepts it, that believes this is what love looks like, that we must bounce back up smiling even when our core feels bruised. Jung might say this is the shadow inherited not from evil parents or malicious adults, but from unconscious generations. The shadow is not just the darkness we hide from others, it's the inherited wound we didn't know was shaping us. And when unexamined, it becomes repetition. You swore you'd never raise your voice like your father, but then one night you do. You swore you'd never accept less than kindness, but then quietly you do. Not because you want to, but because something inside says this is how love works. This is normal. Imagine a symbolic image, a row of dolls, each standing in front of the next, each repeating the gesture of the one before it. A chain of action, reaction, imitation. Not out of malice, but memory. The chain stretches backward across decades through households down bloodlines. And it doesn't break until someone steps out of line literally and figuratively and asks, where did I learn this? And do I still want to carry it? Bandura's findings weren't just about aggression. They were about modeling in all its forms. Children who saw kind behavior also mirrored that. But here's the catch: kindness must be visible. Not just spoken about, but embodied. Not just encouraged, but shown. And in homes where warmth is rare and apology is absent, what's modeled is survival, not connection. Adler would say that every behavior is a response to perceived inferiority. A child who hits may not feel powerful, but powerless. And imitation becomes a way to reclaim control, to become the figure that once loomed over them, to avoid being the one knocked down. And so the hurt becomes the hurter. The victim becomes the disciplinarian. And the cycle continues unless awareness interrupts it. So where does that leave you? Perhaps you were the child watching someone throw the doll, or perhaps you were the doll. Either way, the impact stays. The body remembers. The nervous system adapts. And what's left is a pattern, a reflex that plays out long after the screen is gone. In relationships, in arguments, in silence, and beneath it all, a child still watches, waiting to see what happens next. But here's the thing: awareness is the beginning of change. Not in the dramatic sense, not in burning bridges or rewriting the past, but in slowing down, in pausing before the gesture, in noticing when your hand clenches or your voice rises and asking softly, is this mine? Or inherited, and choosing to speak gently even when you weren't taught how, in becoming the model you never had. Because if violence can be learned, so can softness, so can repair, so can boundaries that don't need yelling to be firm. And maybe you won't get it right every time, but the moment you choose to pause, to reflect, to try, you're already breaking the chain. The doll still stands, but now you see it for what it is: not a toy, not a target, but a symbol of resilience, yes, but also of silence. And maybe, just maybe, you begin to speak not in anger but in intention, You show the child inside you and perhaps the one sitting beside you that there is another way. That power doesn't require harm. That love doesn't have to be proven through pain. And in that choice, in that quiet rewrite of an old script, you begin to teach something new. It begins with a stutter. A child hesitates, unsure of their voice. They repeat a sound just once, maybe twice. It's barely noticeable. But the adult leans in, frowns, and says something like, "You're doing it wrong." The child flinches, a flush of heat in the face, a tightening in the chest. The next time they try to speak, they're more cautious, more rigid. Their words shrink. Their breath shortens. Soon they stop trying to speak at all. Not because they physically can't, but because something deeper has closed inside. This wasn't fiction. This was an actual experiment conducted in 1939, known today as the Monster Study. It was led by Wendell Johnson, a speech pathologist who wanted to explore the roots of stuttering. He divided orphan children into two groups, one praised for fluent speech, the other criticized even when they spoke clearly. The result: children in the negative group developed speech anxiety, verbal paralysis, and long-term damage. They weren't born broken. They were made to feel that way. And this is the paradox: language is not just expression, it's identity. When you teach a child to fear their voice, you don't just silence them in the moment, you fracture their sense of self. You teach them that the act of speaking is dangerous, that their inner world is not welcome in the outer one, that communication is a performance where failure is punished, not a bridge to connection. The Monster Study earned its name not because the children were monsters, but because the adults became them without violence, without visible harm, but through suggestion, through shame, through carefully delivered micro-wounds. And what haunts us isn't just the ethics of the study, it's the familiarity of its mechanics. How many of us learned early on that certain tones made adults frown, that certain emotions invited withdrawal, that certain questions brought silence instead of answers, that our voice could make love disappear? Jung would see this as a trauma to the psyche's ability to individuate. The child unable to express freely begins to split. There is the part that longs to speak, to create, to be heard, and the part that polices every word, fearing rejection. The inner critic is born not from strength, but from adaptation, a guardian forged in moments of embarrassment and disconnection. And once it takes root, it doesn't leave easily. Imagine the symbolic image here: a young child standing in a vast, echoing hall, their mouth open but no sound emerging. Above them, words float like ghosts, past criticisms, raised eyebrows, sarcastic tones, each one a tiny scar on the vocal cords of the soul. The child learns not just to be quiet, but to be invisible, to anticipate judgment before it lands, to abandon the sentence before it's even fully formed. Adler might interpret this as a self-protective identity, the child who internalizes failure as character rather than context. I speak badly becomes I am bad. And so the child becomes hyper-aware, overcorrecting, shrinking into roles where they are less likely to be noticed. They seek safety in silence, but silence when chosen out of fear is not peace, it's exile. And here's the thing: it doesn't always show up as a stutter. Sometimes it shows up as perfectionism, as rehearsing conversations in your head, as feeling your heart race before you speak, even among friends. It looks like turning the camera off in meetings, like sending a text instead of making a call, like writing instead of saying. It looks like doubting your ideas the moment they arise, like rephrasing yourself to sound more acceptable, like apologizing for the space your words take up. This is the legacy of invisible experiments. Not ones conducted in labs, but in homes, classrooms, playgrounds. Experiments where a child expresses something true and receives something cold in return. And they learn less is safer. Quiet is better. Don't say what you think, say what they want to hear. But what if the voice was never broken? What if it was simply buried? What if the real healing isn't about speaking louder, but about unlearning the fear attached to expression? About recognizing that stuttering, hesitation, anxiety, these are not signs of weakness, but echoes. Echoes of moments when vulnerability was punished instead of held. Gabor Mate would say the question isn't, "What's wrong with you?" but "What happened to you?" And when you trace that question gently, patiently, you often arrive at a moment of correction that didn't need to happen. A comment that should have been support but became shame. A teacher who meant to help but reinforced fear. A parent who thought silence meant discipline, not isolation. So what now? Maybe it starts with listening, not to others but to yourself, to the words that hover in your throat before you swallow them, to the opinions you almost voice, to the emotions that ache for language. And maybe, just maybe, you let one sentence out, and then another. Not perfect, not polished, but yours. Because reclaiming your voice isn't about eloquence. It's about permission. It's about looking at the ghosts in the hall and saying, "I'm still here. I still have something to say." And it's not too late to say it. The monster study reminds us of a deep, quiet truth: the human voice is sacred. Not because of how it sounds, but because of what it carries. Story, memory, longing, power. And when we silence someone, even with good intentions, we risk severing the thread that connects them to the world. So tonight, in this gentle space, ask yourself, what did they say that made you afraid to speak? And what do you need to hear now to begin again? You hold a photograph in your hands. It's old, grainy at the edges, faded from time, a moment, frozen in a hue that no longer exists in the world. You stare at it and feel something stir: recognition. A birthday party, perhaps. A balloon. A face smiling beside you that you can't quite name. You remember this day. The cake, the voices, the light. Or do you? Because the longer you stare, the more you realize something feels off. The memory arrives fully formed, yet ungrounded. You can see it, feel it, even smell it, but you can't place where it came from. That's the strange thing about memory. It feels like truth. But sometimes it's fiction wearing a familiar face. And sometimes we remember things that never happened at all. This unsettling phenomenon is what psychologist Elizabeth Loftus uncovered through a series of experiments in the 1970s and 80s research that revealed how disturbingly easy it is to implant false memories into the human mind. In one study, participants were told stories about their childhood, some true, some entirely fabricated, like getting lost in a shopping mall. Many came to believe these false events with vivid detail, even adding their own embellishments. These weren't lies. They weren't performances. They were genuine recollections of events that never occurred. Here lies the paradox. The brain can't always tell the difference between a memory and a suggestion, between something we lived and something we were told we lived. Memory is not a camera, it is a canvas. And every time we revisit it, we repaint it slightly. We add a shadow here, a new color there, until what we recall may be more echo than event. Jung believed that the unconscious shapes our perceptions long before the conscious mind interprets them. So when a memory is formed, it's not just about what happened. It's about how we felt when it happened, what stories we'd already been told, what we were hungry to believe. A false memory, then, is not a glitch. It's a reflection of the psyche's need to make sense of the world, even if that sense requires bending the truth. Imagine the symbolic image: a hallway of mirrors, each one reflecting a slightly different version of the same moment. You walk down the corridor, unsure which reflection is real. Some smile back at you, some frown, some are missing pieces altogether. And somewhere between mirror and memory, you begin to doubt your own mind. But this doesn't only live in psychology labs. It lives in families, in friendships, in the quiet power of repetition. Think of the stories you've heard about yourself. You were always so sensitive. You never liked crowds. You've always been the difficult one. Over time, you begin to remember yourself through the lens of someone else's narrative. And those memories begin to shape your identity. Not because they're accurate, but because they've been reinforced. You remember feeling that way because you were told you always did. This is the quiet danger of suggestion. It doesn't come with flashing lights or loud commands. It comes with offhand comments, old photo albums, conversations overheard in childhood. And the younger we are, the more porous we become, absorbing not just facts, but frameworks. Not just events, but meaning. And if that meaning is flawed, the memory can follow. Adler might frame this through the lens of fictional finalism, the idea that we create guiding narratives to navigate the world regardless of their accuracy. These fictions give us direction, identity, motivation. But if the fiction is rooted in a false memory of being unloved, of always failing, of being inherently broken, it becomes a trap, a self-fulfilling prophecy that governs our choices without our consent. Gabor Mate would ask, what purpose does this false memory serve? What pain does it explain? What wound does it protect? Because often our mind doesn't create false memories randomly. It creates them to survive something, to justify an absence, to make peace with confusion, to anchor us in a world that often feels too fluid to grasp. And this leads to a soft but startling truth. Not all memories are doors to clarity. Some are shelters built on shifting ground. And it's okay to question them, to look gently at the past and ask, did this really happen? Or have I been carrying someone else's story inside my body? This isn't about doubting your entire life. It's about creating space for nuance, for humility, for recognizing that our minds are trying always to make coherence from chaos. And sometimes they fill in the blanks with something that feels right, even if it isn't true. So what does this mean for healing? Perhaps it means being less attached to the specifics of the story and more curious about the feelings beneath it. Maybe the memory of abandonment wasn't a literal event, but a perception, a sense that your needs weren't safe to express. Maybe the story of your failure isn't a singular moment, but a collection of glances, silences, missed validations. Maybe what matters isn't whether it happened exactly as you remember, but how your body still holds the afterimage. The past is not a fixed archive. It's a living ecosystem constantly rewritten by the present. And when we understand that, we gain a strange kind of freedom, not to erase the past, but to soften it, to say maybe I was wrong, or just as powerful, maybe I was right all along. Either way, the point is not to prove, but to understand. So tonight, in this space of reflection, you might hold one of your memories in your hand, not with certainty, but with compassion. You might ask, where did this come from? Who was I when I first believed it? And what would happen if I let it be less solid, more spacious? Because the mind is not a prison. It's a landscape, and memory is a path we can walk with our eyes open even if the trail shifts beneath our feet. It starts as a game. Two groups of boys, strangers at first brought to a summer camp nestled in the quiet woods of Oklahoma. They don't know they're part of a study. They just know their cabins have names now, the Eagles and the Rattlers. They hike, swim, eat, and laugh separately. Then the games begin. A tug of war, a baseball match. Points are tallied, flags are raised, and slowly a shift emerges. The laughter sharpens, the names become insults, food fights break out. The other side becomes less human, more enemy. What began as play transforms into hostility. Belonging becomes territory. Friendship becomes tribalism. This was the Robbers Cave experiment conducted by Muzaffar Sharif in 1954. It was designed to study how quickly in-groups and out-groups form and how little it takes for conflict to erupt. And the findings were clear. Humans don't need deep history to divide. We just need a label, a reason to say us and them. The paradox is startling. Our deepest need for connection often births our most instinctive exclusion. We unite by drawing lines. We form identity by naming an outsider. The boys were not cruel. They were following the gravitational pull of group dynamics. Once categorized, they began to seek superiority, not because they were bad, but because it made them feel significant. Adler spoke of this hunger for belonging as the root of human motivation. But he also warned, when that belonging feels fragile, people begin to seek power instead. And power, when defined by contrast, always requires an opponent. Jung would see this as the shadow of the collective, the projection of unwanted parts onto the other. When we fear our own aggression, we see it in those outside our group. When we deny our own vulnerability, we mock it in the rival. And so the unconscious seeks balance through opposition. Not through integration, but separation. Imagine the symbolic image: two mountains facing each other, each with a flag at its peak. From a distance, they seem identical. but each group climbs their own, convinced their summit is higher. They shout across the valley, not realizing the echo is their own voice returned. In real life, this division happens subtly. It's in the workplace rivalry, the political debate, the family drama. It's in the we that becomes too tight, too closed, too defended. Suddenly, someone on the outside is framed as stupid, or dangerous, or inferior. The jokes shift, the assumptions harden, and the space for nuance disappears. The Robber's Cave experiment didn't just reveal how conflict begins, it revealed how peace is made. When the two groups were given a shared goal, something neither could accomplish alone, they began to cooperate. Fixing a water tank, pulling a stuck truck. The lines blurred, the walls softened. Not because they agreed, but because they had to see each other as humans again. Gabor Mate might suggest that beneath division is pain, a longing to belong so deep, so primal that exclusion feels like a kind of death. And when people feel unseen or powerless, they seek identity wherever it's offered, even if that identity is rooted in opposition. And here's the haunting truth: we often feel most united when we have someone to fight. Conflict becomes glue. And once that glue dries, it takes effort, real effort, to dissolve it. But there is another path. One that requires stepping back from the flag, the team, the story. One that asks, what do I gain by keeping this person other? What parts of myself am I protecting through this division? Because the enemy often mirrors something internal. The traits we mock may be the ones we repress. The flaws we highlight may be fears we carry. And the louder we shout, the less we hear the quieter truth beneath, that we are not so different. That the divide is often a defense. So how do we bridge it? Not by erasing difference, but by shifting focus. From competition to collaboration, from blame to curiosity, from narrative to presence. You don't have to agree to connect. You just have to pause long enough to see the human under the label. And maybe it starts with a question. Soft, sincere. What are you protecting? What are you afraid to lose? Because beneath every conflict is a desire to feel safe, to feel known, to feel worthy. And when that is acknowledged, even briefly, the war loses some of its fuel. So picture it again, the two hills. The boy's older now, looking across the valley, not with anger, but with memory. Realizing that the flags still fly, but the wind feels different. Realizing that there was never an enemy, just another group of kids trying to matter. And in that realization, perhaps a whisper of peace. Not perfect, not final, but enough to walk down the mountain and meet in the field below. The video begins. 6 people pass a basketball between them, 3 in white shirts, 3 in black. You're given a task count, how many times the players in white pass the ball. You focus, eyes narrowed. 1, 2, 3. You track each movement carefully. And when the clip ends, you give your answer. 25. Maybe 26. Then the question comes, did you see the gorilla? You frown. What gorilla? They replay the clip. And there it is, plain as day. A person in a full gorilla suit strolls through the middle of the scene, pauses, beats their chest, and walks away. You watch it again and again, stunned. How could you have missed something so obvious? This was the selective attention test designed by psychologists Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons in 1999. It was meant to illustrate inattentional blindness, the mind's tendency to miss unexpected events when focused on something else. It's not a flaw. It's how the brain copes with overwhelm. But it also reveals something deeper. What we don't see isn't always because it's hidden. Sometimes, it's because we're not looking. Here's the paradox. Attention sharpens detail but narrows truth. When you fixate, you filter. And what's filtered out can be astonishingly important. In life, we miss not just gorillas in the room, but red flags, soft warnings, opportunities, even entire emotions, because we're too focused on the task we believe matters most. Jung would call this the tyranny of the conscious mind, our tendency to identify with what we're doing, what we've planned, what we think is important. Meanwhile, the unconscious murmurs in the background, waving its arms, beating its chest, waiting to be seen. And yet, we stay locked on the ball. Imagine the symbolic image, a spotlight illuminating a small circle on a vast stage. In the light, we see actors performing a script. But just beyond that beam, figures move. Quiet, significant, unseen. We say the stage is empty because we've confused brightness with reality. So ask yourself, what gorilla have you missed? What truth stood plainly in front of you, unrecognized because your gaze was elsewhere? Was it a friend's pain hidden beneath a smile? A boundary you ignored because you were chasing approval? An instinct that stirred once then disappeared under the weight of logic? This isn't about blame, it's about awareness. Gabor Mate would suggest that we often miss what hurts to see. We learn early to tune out what threatens connection, anger, grief, truth that makes others uncomfortable. Our attention becomes not just focused, but curated, biased, shaped by survival. And in this blindness, we begin to believe our perception is complete. We say, I know what's going on. I'm paying attention. But attention is not comprehension. And sometimes the thing we most need to notice is the one we've trained ourselves not to. This lives not just in labs, but in everyday life. The parent who misses the quiet withdrawal of a child. The partner who misses the look of detachment in an otherwise normal conversation. The person who chases productivity, unaware of the creeping numbness in their own chest. We tell ourselves the game matters. We count the passes. We perform. And all the while, the gorilla walks through the room. Adler might say that our goals dictate our vision. If we're seeking success, we'll filter for signs of progress and miss signs of depletion. If we're seeking acceptance, we'll scan for smiles and miss signs of disconnection. The brain filters reality to match the goal. And in doing so, it sometimes cuts out what matters most. So, how do we widen the beam? Not by trying to see everything. That's impossible. But by softening the focus. By asking not just, what am I doing, but what am I not noticing? By pausing. Letting the gaze go slack. Listening for the strange beat in the background. And maybe by inviting the unexpected. The gorilla in the experiment wasn't just a test. It was a reminder that life contains more than we believe. That even in rooms we think we've mastered, something mysterious may be moving. That wonder is not always in the center of the frame. Sometimes it walks in unannounced and waits to be acknowledged. So tonight, take a moment to turn your head. Not metaphorically, literally. Look at the edge of the room you're in. Feel your body. Sense the emotions beneath the surface. What are you not counting? What has slipped through the cracks of your awareness, not because it's irrelevant, but because it didn't fit the task? And maybe you'll catch a glimpse, not of a gorilla, but of something equally astonishing, a truth you've carried all along. That's been waiting for your eyes to soften your focus, to expand your mind. To say, I didn't see that before, but I do now. The room is empty except for a table, a chair, and a single marshmallow resting quietly on a plate. A child sits alone, legs swinging, eyes wide. Across from them, a calm adult gives simple instructions. You can eat this marshmallow now, but if you wait until I come back, you'll get two. The adult leaves. The door closes. Silence. At first, the child stares, then squirms, then fidgets. They look away, hum to themselves. Some touch the marshmallow, smell it, nibble its edge before quickly setting it back down. Others cover their eyes, trying to erase the temptation by erasing sight. Some last minutes, others only seconds. A few succeed, many do not. This was the famous marshmallow test conducted by Walter Mischel in the 1960s, designed to study delayed gratification in children. But what it truly revealed was something far deeper: how we relate to desire, to reward, and to ourselves when no one is watching. The paradox here is sharp. What looks like willpower may actually be fear. And what appears to be failure might be honesty. The child who eats the marshmallow is not weaker, just less trained to wait. Perhaps because life has not taught them that rewards will come later. Perhaps because waiting for them has rarely been safe. Desire isn't the problem. The absence of trust is. Adler believed that behavior is purposeful, directed toward imagined futures. The child who waits is not just resisting sugar, they are reaching for a story. If I do the right thing, good will follow. But what if life has already taught them the opposite? What if they've learned that promises break, that adults don't return, that the second marshmallow might never come? So they eat, not out of greed, but out of realism, out of pain, out of a kind of wisdom formed too early. And this test, repeated and analyzed, became more than a study. It became a metaphor for discipline, for success, for the ability to delay what we want now, for what we think we'll want more later. But what gets lost in this metaphor is the body of the child, the environment, the history, the nervous system shaped by unpredictability. And the truth that for many choosing now isn't impulsive, it's adaptive. Gabor Mate would remind us that self-regulation is not equally available to all. It is learned, modeled, grown in safe soil. And when the roots are shallow, when chaos or neglect or fear distort early trust, then the self clings to the present. Not because it lacks vision, but because it's never known consistency. Imagine the symbolic image, a delicate scale held in the hands of a child. One side weighed down by the promise of later, the other trembling with the weight of now. The child looks to the door uncertain, not just about the treat, but about life itself. Will they come back? Will the promise be kept? And that uncertainty becomes the loudest thing in the room. Jung might say the marshmallow is not just a treat. It is a symbol of the psyche's tension between impulse and restraint, between the wild self that wants and the cultured self that waits. We are all that child in some form, negotiating with our longing. And so, as adults, we repeat this test in countless ways. You want to send the message now? But tell yourself to wait. You want to rest? But push through. You want to express affection? But wait for a sign that it will be received. The marshmallow becomes emotional, relational, existential. We learn to postpone our needs, our truths, our softness, all in the hope that something better will arrive if we just hold on a little longer. But at what cost? Sometimes we become so good at delaying that we forget how to receive. The second marshmallow comes, but we no longer feel joy. We've trained ourselves to suppress wanting so completely that even abundance feels empty. Or worse, undeserved. And sometimes we delay forever. Not because it's wise, but because we're afraid of being seen reaching for what we want. Desire becomes shame. Pleasure becomes guilt. The act of allowing becomes something suspicious. This is the trap of overcontrol, of mistaking self-denial for virtue. And it too has a cost, because there is a part of you, the inner child, still seated at that table, who simply wants to trust that it's okay to enjoy something, to receive, to let the sweetness melt on your tongue without fear that it makes you weak. So perhaps the lesson is not to always wait and not to always reach, but to pause just long enough to ask, what part of me is making this choice? Is it fear? Is it trust? Is it habit? Because true self-regulation doesn't mean silencing desire. It means listening to it, understanding where it comes from, and then choosing not reflexively, not out of fear, but consciously. So tonight, picture yourself in that room again. The marshmallow before you. The door closed, and no one watching. This time there is no right choice, only honesty. You can eat it, you can wait, you can split it in two. You can name your desire and honor it not as proof of strength or weakness, but as a part of you that deserves to be in the room. Because in the end, the real test is not whether you delay gratification. It's whether you can meet your desire with compassion instead of control. In a small, sterile cage sits a baby monkey barely old enough to stand. There are two surrogate mothers inside. One is made of wire, cold and mechanical, but it holds a bottle. The other is covered in soft cloth, warm to the touch, shaped to resemble comfort, but it offers no food. The monkey, driven by hunger, approaches the wire mother to drink. But once fed, it retreats not to the one who fed it, but to the cloth mother. It clings, trembling. It buries its face in the folds of synthetic warmth. It chooses comfort over sustenance. And when frightened, it doesn't run to where food comes from, it runs to where it feels safe. This was the work of Harry Harlow in the 1950s, a psychologist whose experiments exposed something fundamental about our nature. Nourishment alone is not enough. We are not just fed by calories, we are fed by connection. The paradox here is gentle yet immense. We survive on food, but we thrive on touch. And when the two are separated, we learn to associate love not with care, but with transaction, with performance, with dependency that meets the body's needs while starving the soul. Harlow's monkeys, when raised only with wire mothers, developed deep psychological distress. They rocked back and forth. They pulled out their own hair. They showed signs of depression, anxiety, social dysfunction. When placed in play environments, they froze or lashed out. They were alive but disconnected, intact but fractured. And what about us? What happens when love for us came more often through function than feeling? When praise was given only for achievement? When comfort was withheld as punishment? When the arms that held us felt tense, distracted, or absent altogether? We may have received what we needed to survive. But did we receive what we needed to feel whole? Gabor Mate speaks often of attachment versus authenticity. That as children, when these two needs come into conflict, we will always sacrifice authenticity first. We will become who they need us to be. We will smile when we want to cry, perform when we want to rest, seek approval when what we really long for is to be held. And eventually the wire mother becomes familiar, predictable. The softness we truly crave begins to feel foreign, even suspicious. Jung might say that the unheld child never leaves us, that inside, even in adulthood, there remains a creature reaching. And when touch has been denied, distorted, or conditional, that reaching becomes silent, hesitant. We seek substitutes, control, validation, success, distraction. But they never quite fill the shape of what was missing. Because what was missing was never something extraordinary. It was something so basic, so quiet, that we almost forgot to name it the right to be held without needing to earn it. Imagine the symbolic image: a pair of arms made of light reaching out through a fog, while a figure stands still just inches away, afraid to move. The light is real. The arms are open, but the memory of wire still lingers on the skin. And so they hesitate. Not because they don't want love, but because they're not sure how to receive it. This lives in your body, in the way you flinch at affection you didn't expect, in the way you apologize before asking for comfort, in the way you turn to logic when feeling becomes overwhelming. It's the inner monkey still searching for the cloth, still unsure if it's allowed. Adler believed we are goal-oriented beings, but what happens when the early goal becomes, don't need too much, don't be a burden, be strong so they'll stay? That belief grows up with us. It shapes our relationships. We choose partners who feel distant because we've learned how to chase. We dismiss compliments because we've learned to distrust warmth. We overfunction, overgive, overthink, just to feel worthy of basic tenderness. And yet there is a part of you that remembers. That soft animal longing. The way your body relaxes when held just right. The way your breath slows when someone sits beside you without needing you to speak. That part is not gone. It is simply quiet, patient, waiting for you to turn toward it. The mistake is believing this need makes you weak. In truth, it makes you human. And healing doesn't come from rejecting it, but from befriending it, from letting it speak, from choosing relationships internal and external, where comfort is not conditional, where you don't have to trade performance for affection. So tonight, as you sit in this quiet space, ask yourself, what kind of love do I still crave? And where did I first learn that it wasn't safe to ask for it? You may find that the answer is tender, that it's wrapped in memories you rarely visit, that it speaks in a voice smaller than you're used to hearing. But that voice matters. That monkey still reaching matters. And maybe you offer your own arms first. You let yourself be the cloth mother, the warm space, the safe lap, the steady presence that says without needing words, you don't have to earn this. You never did. It's late. A woman cries out in the dark, her voice piercing the stillness of a New York street. Lights flicker on in nearby apartments, curtains shift, eyes peer out, but no one moves. The sound comes again, a struggle, a gasp, then silence. Later it's discovered that more than 30 people heard her, saw her, but no one called the police. No one went down to help. Each person thought the others would do something, and so no one did. This was the tragedy of Kitty Genovese in 1964, an event that would give birth to the psychological concept known as the bystander effect. The idea that the presence of others can actually reduce the likelihood of individual action. The more people witness suffering, the less likely anyone is to intervene. The paradox is chilling when everyone sees responsibility becomes invisible. When help feels like someone else's job, it rarely becomes yours. We imagine we'd be the exception, that we'd act, that we'd help. But experiments tell another story. In controlled settings, researchers staged emergencies, someone collapsing, a cry for help, smoke filling a room. Again and again, individuals alone responded quickly. But when others were present, especially if those others remained passive, responses slowed. Sometimes they didn't come at all. And this doesn't live only in dramatic moments. It lives in the everyday. The bullying we witness but don't interrupt. The colleague clearly struggling, but we assume someone else will check in. The stranger on the train silently unraveling while we stare at our phones. The subtle, invisible pain that we notice but don't name. Jung would suggest that the diffusion of responsibility is not just social, it's spiritual. That in the presence of the crowd, the ego dissolves not into unity but into avoidance. We become less ourselves, not in transcendence, but in anonymity. And within that anonymity, conscience fades. Not entirely, but just enough. Imagine the symbolic image: a street lined with windows, all glowing softly. Behind each pane, a person watches. No one speaks, no one moves. A single figure lies on the sidewalk, unmoving, framed by all this passive light. The scene is quiet, but beneath the stillness is a collective fracture. Gabor Mate might say we are not indifferent, we are overwhelmed. Numbed by exposure, conditioned by fear, disconnected from our own internal signals of empathy. We see suffering but do not trust that we have the tools to face it. Or worse, we've been punished before for intervening. So we learn to watch, to scroll, to stay neutral. But neutrality in the face of harm is never neutral. It's silent participation. And yet the answer isn't shame. Shame paralyzes too. It pushes us deeper into inaction, afraid of choosing wrong, of looking foolish, of becoming the new target. The path forward is not heroic. It's human. It's one small moment of attention, a glance held longer, a question asked, a step taken before the mind talks you out of it. Adler would remind us that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to act despite it. To stand up not because you're certain, but because you remember what it feels like to need someone, and be met with silence. So ask yourself, when have I stood by hoping someone else would act? And what did it cost me to remain still? The answer is not to punish the past, but to understand it. To begin noticing the ways in which you've been taught to retreat, and to gently question that reflex. Because even one voice, one movement can shift the entire atmosphere. Studies show that when one person intervenes, others follow. The freeze breaks, the silence fractures. And in that rupture, something sacred enters responsibility. Not in the burdensome sense, but in the sacred one. The ability to respond. And that's all it takes sometimes. A breath, a step, a question. So tonight, as you reflect in this quiet space, ask gently, who suffers in silence? Because I thought someone else would help. What small action could I take next time, even if it's imperfect? You are not responsible for everything, but you are capable of more than you believe. The street remains. The windows remain. But maybe next time the figure doesn't lie alone. Maybe one light turns off. A door opens. A voice calls out, "Are you okay?" And maybe that voice is yours. You say one thing, but do another. You believe in honesty, but tell a small lie to avoid discomfort. You think of yourself as kind, but ignore the call you didn't want to take. You value health, but reach for the sugar when the night feels empty. And as the action happens, attention stirs, not loud, not sharp, but quietly disorienting. A psychological friction between who you are and what you just did. This is cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of inconsistency. And the mind, hungry for coherence, begins to twist. It edits the story. I had no choice. It wasn't that bad. Everyone does this, and with every small rewrite, the self moves just slightly away from itself. Leon Festinger, who coined the term in the 1950s, revealed something quietly terrifying. We don't always change our behavior to fit our beliefs. We often change our beliefs to fit our behavior. The need for internal harmony is so strong that when disrupted, we'll bend reality itself to make it make sense. The paradox: we lie to ourselves, not to deceive, but to survive the psychic tension between identity and action. Imagine the symbolic image: a spiral staircase winding downward, each step a rationalization, each turn a soft denial. At first, you barely notice you're descending. You still feel upright. But slowly, the walls narrow, the light dims, and one day you look up and realize how far you've come from the surface. Jung would say the psyche is always seeking integration, but dissonance reveals our refusal to meet all parts of ourselves. Instead, we split. We exile the shame, the contradiction, the failure. We say that wasn't me, but it was. And until we welcome it back, not to justify it, but to understand it, we remain at war with our own reflection. You might see this spiral in your life already, in the way you justify staying in something that's slowly eroding your joy, in the excuses you give for silence when your truth aches to speak, in the beliefs you once held firmly, now chipped away by years of compromise. And it's not because you're weak. It's because the gap between value and behavior is hard to live inside, and somewhere deep down, we'd rather be wrong than fragmented. Gabor Mate would say this pattern emerges when our actions violate the needs of the self, but we're too disconnected to feel the breach. The body registers it though: tension, anxiety, fatigue. Dissonance is not just cognitive, it's embodied. A nervous system flinching at its own contradictions. Adler too would point toward our striving, that every human moves toward a felt sense of significance. And when our actions misalign with that striving, we'll revise the story so we can still feel purposeful, even if the purpose has become distorted. I only did it to protect them. I had to. It wasn't really a choice. And the more convincing the narrative, the deeper the spiral. But there is another option. Not to spin, but to stop. To pause in the stairwell and look honestly at where we are. To say, I believed this, but I did that. Why not to punish, but to explore? Not to shame, but to understand. Because dissonance, when met gently, can be a doorway. It can show us where we're out of alignment, not as failure, but as feedback, as invitation. And when you name the gap, you gain the power to close it, not with perfection, but with presence. Imagine doing this in real time. You catch yourself about to say yes when you mean no. You feel the tug of old people-pleasing instincts, the urge to maintain harmony at the cost of your truth. But instead of pushing through, you pause. You ask, if I say yes now, who am I abandoning? Or you reflect on something you did, something small but misaligned. And instead of justifying it, you sit with the discomfort. You let it sting just enough to be instructive. And then gently you ask, what would it look like to choose differently next time? This is not about becoming morally pure. It's about becoming internally consistent, not in rigid ideology, but in integrity, in wholeness, in being able to look in the mirror and say, that was me, all of it, and I'm still here, still learning. Because the spiral only deepens when we run from ourselves. But when we face the dissonance, we begin to climb, one honest step at a time. So tonight, in this quiet place, you might ask, where am I spinning a story to make my reflection easier to bear? And what would happen if I told myself the truth instead? You might feel the sting at first, but beneath that sting, clarity. And beneath that clarity, peace. Not the peace of perfection, but the peace of alignment, of choosing again and again to return to the center. There's no clipboard, no lab coat, no two-way mirror. But somehow, you feel observed. Watched not just by people, but by something bigger. Algorithms, trends, feedback loops, metrics you never signed up for. You post a photo and wait for the dopamine of approval. You share a thought and calculate its reception. You scroll and scroll and scroll, thinking you're the subject when in fact, you're the data. The experiment, not in a lab, but in life itself. Welcome to the new Psychology Study 1 where no one told you you'd signed the consent form. This is the paradox: you feel in control, but are constantly influenced. You believe you're choosing, but your choices have been curated. And the question you once asked of others, would you obey or rebel, now turns inward: am I living or being shaped? Imagine the symbolic image: a maze made of glass, invisible until you bump into it. You run towards something: approval, connection, validation, but the path subtly redirects you. Not with walls, with nudges, with recommendations, with invisible hands guiding your attention, your time, your thoughts. Not maliciously, just efficiently. And one day you stop and ask, was this ever really my direction? In the past, psychology studied people in controlled settings. Now the setting is uncontrolled, and we study ourselves through our screens. We become our own observers, trapped in endless feedback loops. Our beliefs are sharpened not by contemplation, but by repetition. The longer we stare, the more certain we feel. Not because it's true, but because it's familiar. Jung would see this as the loss of individuation emerging with the collective shadow. The self dissolves not into transcendence, but into sameness. We start to perform not just for others, but for a version of ourselves we barely recognize. A brand, a projection, a profile curated for applause. Adler might remind us all behavior moves toward perceived significance. In a hyper-connected world, significance is measurable: likes, views, responses. So we adjust. We learn what gets rewarded and lean toward it, not consciously, but slowly, imperceptibly, and the original self, uncurated, unbranded, begins to fade. Gabor Mate would ask, what does this adaptation protect us from? Loneliness, shame, the pain of rejection. We become the experiment, yes, but also the hypothesis. If I show this version of myself, will they love me? And maybe they do. But then what? Each approval binds us tighter to the mask. We chase the next version of applause, sacrificing truth for trend, authenticity for safety. The modern bystander doesn't just fail to intervene, they forget who they were before the stage was built. Yet the experiment is not without hope, because to be aware of the experiment is to begin stepping outside it. Not completely, but enough to ask the first real question: what part of me was designed for observation? And what part is still wild, unseen, my own? You begin to notice when you're performing, when your voice changes slightly in different rooms, when your ideas bend subtly to what will be received well, when your silence is not peace but censorship. And slowly, you turn inward. You ask, who am I when no one is watching, when there's no metric, no mirror, no need to optimize? The answer may arrive quietly, in solitude, in breath, in art made for no one, in tears not shared, in laughter not recorded, in moments that don't become content, but become you. Imagine now the maze made of glass begins to melt, not because you escape it, but because you stop trying to win it. You stop measuring your humanity in likes or labels. You let yourself be confusing, inconsistent, honest, the kind of honest that doesn't land well, the kind that's still real. Because rebellion in this era is not noise, it's stillness. Not protest signs, but presence. To be unseen, unscored, unshaped. To opt out not of the world, but of its illusions. So tonight, ask softly, where am I performing a self that no longer fits? And if I stepped off the stage even briefly, who would I find behind the curtain? Because yes, you were part of the experiment. But now, you are the observer too. And the moment you remember that you are no longer just the subject, you are the one who asks the questions. And that always is where real change begins. So we've walked through the rooms, 15 of them, each one shaped like a question, a mirror, a silent test. We stood in the shock chamber beside Milgram, our finger hovering over the switch. We watched Zimbardo's guard slip into cruelty like it was clothing. We counted lines, chased marshmallows, ignored the gorilla, and stood frozen by the side of the road while someone else cried for help. And through it all, the question lingered: not just would I obey or rebel, but what makes me me? When the pressure rises, when no one's looking, when the room begins to shift, you may feel uneasy. You may feel seen. Because what these experiments expose isn't evil, they expose patterns. They show us how easily we yield to roles, to rules, to silence. They reveal how belief is flexible, how memory is fragile, how even love can be shaped by the conditions under which it was offered. They whisper a truth most of us carry, but rarely name. We are not as fixed, as certain, as sovereign as we like to believe. But maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's a beginning. Because if we are shaped, then we can reshape. If we've been conditioned, then we can unlearn. These experiments don't trap us. They illuminate us. They show the levers, the strings, the illusions. And when we see them, we begin to choose. With a little more intention, a little more presence, a little more softness toward the parts of ourselves that once froze, once conformed, once obeyed. Not because we lacked strength, but because we lacked space. This isn't about becoming pure. It's about becoming aware. About remembering that rebellion doesn't have to be loud. It can be a pause, a breath, a refusal to press the button, a willingness to speak the truth even if your voice trembles, a hand reaching out when the world looks away. You are not the results of an experiment. You are the presence that notices, the one who asks, the one who remembers I have a choice, even when the room says otherwise. So let that awareness carry you forward, not as pressure but as possibility. Not as a demand to be perfect, but as an invitation to be real. If you made it this far, maybe something in you has already shifted. Not because you were told what to think, but because you were given space to feel. These experiments, these reflections, they're not just academic stories. They're invitations to slow down, to question the roles we play, to notice the quiet places where we hand over our agency, not with resistance, but with routine. And maybe now the next time you find yourself hesitating to speak, to stand, to choose, you'll remember that most people don't obey out of malice. They obey because the world taught them it was safer. But awareness changes that. It plants a seed, a soft refusal, a quiet, private revolution. If this resonated, leave a comment. What moment stayed with you? What thought kept you up tonight? You're not alone in this reflection. And if this feels like home, like a place where your questions belong, like and subscribe. We're just getting started.